So I'll start with just going through who we were talking to and the basic respondent information. So this was 1,005 general population Americans. So the sample was representative of the American population in terms of gender, education, age, income, racial profile, and region. And then in terms of their participation in archaeology, fewer than 1 in 10 in the sample were currently employed or studying an archaeology related field. But about a third had either visited an archaeological site, and then 1 in 10 have participated in a dig or lab work. And then among those who hadn't participated in archaeology in any way, 40% did say they would be interested in participating in the future. And then in terms of their voting activity, the majority of respondents were currently registered to vote and also did vote in the past presidential election in 2020. And then lastly, looking at their museum visiting habits, about a third of this sample had visited a history-related museum in the past year. And it's important to note that college-educated Americans were significantly more likely to have visited a museum compared to those without a college degree. So I'll get into the first key finding regarding overall interest in archaeology. And also stop me at any point if you guys have any questions or if I'm going too fast. Overall, 1/4 of Americans were interested in archaeology, which mirrored what we saw back in 2018. This is also the similar level of interest in other scientific topics like oceanography, astronomy, and zoology. And interestingly, in this version of the survey, we included an option for interest in history or historic preservation. And Americans had the most amount of interest in that topic compared to other scientific areas. Looking specifically at who has more interest in archaeology, there were some differences by education level, gender, voting status, and museum habits. So, on an 11-point scale, where higher scores are more interest, there was significant more interest among college degree holders, men, registered voters, and people who had recently visited a history related museum compared to their counterparts. And then looking at the profile of Americans who are interested in archaeology relative to the general population, it's overall fairly similar, but the people who are interested in archaeology tend to lean slightly more male and slightly more college educated. And then a little bit more white Americans were interested compared to the overall sample or the overall population. This is very similar to what was seen in 2018, though in 2018, a higher percentage of Hispanics were interested in archaeology than are now. So looking at specific interest in subjects, this was consistent with 2018, where Americans were more interested in American history or the past in general compared to archaeology. So on that 11-point scale, American history got a 6.6 on average, and the past got a 6.4, whereas archaeology was on average rated a 5.2 in interest levels. Um, and in terms of what they were most interested in, Americans have the most interest in subjects related to animals and then American history, and the least amount of interest in pottery, relics, or artifacts. And there were some differences by people's interest in archaeology. So, Americans who are interested in the topic were significantly more interested in all scientific subjects and also more interested in subjects related to archaeology, like the past or ancient civilizations. Whereas those who were not interested in archaeology had the least amount of interest in any of these subjects. So then looking specifically at the group who says they're not interested. So these were people who, on that 11-point scale, rated it a 3 or below in terms of interest level. That's about 1 in 5 Americans, so 19%. And Their primary reason for disinterest was that they felt it's not important to them, or they just hadn't had the opportunity to learn about archaeology or be involved in it in any way. There were some differences among the people familiar with the topic and those not. So people who are not familiar with archaeology and who aren't interested primarily said it's because it's not important to them. Whereas people who are familiar with archaeology but aren't interested, they were more likely to say they don't have the time. So this could mean they don't have the time to learn about it or to dedicate any time to being involved with the topic. So then getting into people's overall opinions, so what people think about archaeology and what they think about the protection and funding of archaeological sites. So when asked if they think archaeology is important, the majority of Americans, so 88% of them said that they think that the work that archaeologists do is important, which is just a slight drop from 2018, but was not a significant difference. And the vast majority of all groups agree, but agreement was slightly higher among people who are familiar with the topic and college educated individuals. There were no differences among registered voters or people who had recently visited a museum. And then looking at what they think it's important to, about three-quarters of Americans agree archaeology is important to the nation in general. So 73% think it's important to the nation in general, but fewer say that the same about archaeology's importance to themselves, so to their community or their personal life or heritage, or also to shaping public policy and the economy. So it's just under half for all of those, but that is still, at least 2 in 5 who are agreeing that it's important to these areas. And then looking at that same question by voter status, there's actually minimal differences between registered voters and non-registered voters in their belief about archaeology's importance to themselves or to the nation in general. Registered voters were slightly more likely to say that it's important to the nation or to their community, but that difference was not significant. And in terms of their beliefs about the protection of archaeological sites, 77% of Americans did say there should be laws to protect American archaeological sites or artifacts. And then just slightly less believe that preserving archaeological sites should be a priority for the government. And over half are saying that the funding and discovery of protection and protection of these sites should be increased, and they're concerned that they aren't being well protected by the government. And then that same question by registered voters, we do see that registered voters are significantly more likely to agree that the government should focus on creating laws for the protection of archaeological sites and artifacts. So 80% of them agree with that statement. And then they're also slightly more likely to agree that government funding should increase for the protection and discovery of these sites, and that they're concerned that these sites aren't being well protected. And then in this question, when they were asked to choose on a binary between these two statements, so should the United States set aside more land associated with archaeological sites as a protected territory, or on the other hand, should the US reduce the amount of land set aside as protected territory, even if the land has a significant connection to the past? And so when asked to choose between these two statements, the overwhelming majority believed that more land should be associated with archaeological sites as protected territories. So then getting into knowledge of archaeology, so how well Americans understand the topic and what it studies. We see that 57% of Americans say they're at least somewhat familiar with archaeology, which is an 8-point drop from 2018, where it was 65%. So there is slightly lower familiarity now, but there is greater familiarity among college degree holders, men, and Americans who visited a museum in the past 12 months. And those were the same groups who were more familiar back in 2018. So then in terms of what field of study Americans think archaeology is a part of, 3/4 of them say that archaeology is a scientific field, and part of the field of sciences. And this was basically the same proportion who said the same in 2018. And that was higher among the people familiar with archaeology, voters, and people who had visited a museum. But on the other hand, we asked this year if they consider it to be part of the field of humanities, and we see that 51% say it's also part of the field of humanities. So there is some overlap between people who think it's part of the sciences and versus part of the humanities. And again, there are the people more familiar with archaeology and people who have visited a museum were more likely to believe it's a humanities subject. So in terms of what people think archaeologists study, most Americans correctly believe that archaeologists study artifacts or past cultures. And then about 62% believe that they study human remains. There's still a little bit of misconception with just under half of Americans believing archaeologists study dinosaurs. Um, and then on the lower end of the list, about 3 in 10 think that they study shipwrecks or written and spoken stories. And then looking at that same question, so what people think archaeologists study, but by their familiarity with archaeology, we see that overall, people familiar with the subject are more likely to believe they study artifacts, past cultures, human remains, pottery, native people and societies, and shipwrecks or spoken stories. But still, about half, so 49%, still said that they believe archaeologists study dinosaurs. And then getting to where people are learning about archaeology and where they would like to learn more about archaeology in the future. People are primarily learning about the subject from television, museums, or classrooms and textbooks. And this was the same top three areas where people were learning about the subject back in 2018. But important to note that over 1 in 10 Americans, so 13%, said they had never learned about archaeology. So there's some people who are still really unfamiliar with the topic. And then under that, the other areas where people are learning were movies, print media, online news, or books and social media. And then though this is showing the difference between 2023 and 2018 for where people are learning. So those top three areas are television, museums, and textbooks are still the same, but the percentage of people learning about archaeology is decreasing. So there's slightly fewer no people learning about the subject from these areas now. And also, there isn't a big difference between college degree holders and people who don't have a college degree in terms of where they're learning about archaeology. But people with a college degree are more likely to have learned about the subject from museums or classrooms and textbooks. And then getting into where people want to learn about archaeology. So this is among people who are interested in the topic or at least show some interest. So they rated it at a 4 or above in their interest level. Those people primarily want to learn about the subject from museums, television, and then movies, which were the same three areas that people wanted to learn from in 2018. And lastly, people were asked if they think archaeology should be part of school curriculum, and the vast majority, 86%, did think that Americans should learn about archaeology at some point in their academic career. The largest share believed it should be part of high school curriculum, and then under that, the largest share thought middle school curriculum. Just 4% didn't think it should be part of any school curriculum. So then I'll get into summarizing our key findings. Let me know if there's anything you want me to jump back to. But overall interest in archaeology remains unchanged since 2018, with about a quarter of Americans interested in the subject. Interest level is higher among those with college degree, men, and registered voters. And Americans show a higher level of interest towards history or the past in general compared to archaeology. The largest share of Americans, so 55%, feel neutral towards the subject, but 1 in 5 express disinterest towards the field, primarily because they don't feel it's important to them or they've just never had the opportunity to learn about the subject. Um, the majority of Americans do think there should be laws protecting archaeological sites and artifacts, and that there's not enough government protection for these sites. And 2/3 say preserving archaeological sites should be a priority for the US government. And registered voters are a lot more likely to agree that the government should create protective laws for American archaeological sites and artifacts. And in terms of archaeology's importance to Americans, about 3/4 agree that the work of archaeologists is important to the nation, and 9 in 10 say that the work of archaeologists is important overall. They're less likely to agree that it's important to their communities, to their personal life and their heritage, or to shaping public policy and the economy. But the belief in the importance of archaeological work is higher among the people familiar with the topic and higher educated Americans. And 86% do think that it should be part of school curriculum at some point in students' careers. And lastly, in terms of familiarity, just over half say they're at least somewhat familiar with archaeology, which is a slight drop from 2018. So people are a little less familiar now. People more familiar if they were college educated, male, or they had recently visited a museum. And overall, they're pretty well informed about what archaeologists study in terms of the majority thinking they study artifacts or past cultures, but some misconceptions still exist with the belief that archaeologists study dinosaurs. And they're sort of torn on if archaeology is part of the sciences, with 73% saying it's part of the sciences, but half saying it's part of the humanities. And they primarily want to learn about archaeology from museums, television, or classrooms and textbooks. That's the whole of the presentation. If anybody has any questions or something I should jump back to, please let me know.